Good evening, everyone. It's a little after 7. We'll get started. We got a full agenda tonight. Are there any adjustments to the agenda? Okay. So we should probably do introductions. I'm Julie Potter. I'm from East Montpelier.
Bonnie Waninger, staff.
Alan Quackenbush, Duxbury.
Don LaHaye, Waitsfield. Bob Winnick, Berlin.
Jamie Stewart, Central Vermont Economic Development.
Steve Lotspeech, Waterbury.
Lee Catanio, Orange.
Michael Gray, Woodbury.
Dara Torrey, Moortown.
Ron Corral, Middlesex.
Kirby Keaton, Montpelier.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Eileen Coats here from Downstreet Housing.
Byron Howard, Berrytown.
Peter Kirby, Washington.
Melissa Seifert, Marshfield.
Amy Hornblass, Cabot. Paula Emery, Clayfield, Alderton. Sue Chartrand, staff. Mosley, Bexworth.
Welcome, everyone. Appreciate you being here. And do we have any public comments tonight? Not hearing any. We will get on to our first item on the agenda, and that is the update from Jamie Stewart at Central Vermont Economic Development Corp.
Yeah, I'm going to start off with something that I wasn't asked to tell you about, but it was a good reminder. On April 3rd, CVRPC, in collaboration with the Department of Labor and Creative Workforce Solutions, is holding our 10th annual job fair, Central Vermont Job Fair at the Barry Auditorium from 10 to 4. Last year we had over 70 exhibitors, vendors, businesses that were there, had over 700 attendees. We expect that we'll at least match that and possibly exceed that. If you know people that are looking for work, very clearly this event is no longer an event just for unemployed people. Last year, over 50% of the people attending were currently employed and looking for upgrades and skills. Some of our companies were very pleased with the quality of the people that they got, including one of the healthcare facilities who had jobs listed for people with master's degrees and had 7 people who had the specific qualifications that they need show up at the event. So if you know anybody who is looking for work or interested in work or is interested in maybe exploring potential career changes, April 3rd at the Barry Auditorium from 10 to 4. And with that, what I'll do is I'll go into the, could you put up the PowerPoint over here? And the only reason for the PowerPoint is it just makes it easier for you to see some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about. I had been asked to give you guys a quick rundown update on the Northern Borders Regional Commission grant rounds. This past Friday, the grant criteria was first announced and the structure on it. But just as a quick background, the Northern Borders Regional Commission was established, I think at this point it's about 4 years ago that it was first created. It includes New York, a portion of upstate New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And was originally in Vermont, was only the northern 5 counties. We just missed on that process. And it provides funding to support rural communities along the border. With support from our congressional delegation, the state of Vermont applied to have the entire state eligible to be participating in the Northern Borders. And yeah, good place to go. We'll run from that. So as you can see, there's $3.5 million for projects in each state. About $500,000. I'll kick around the easiest way for you to see. Here is a list of the grants that were awarded last year. If you go to the nrbc.gov, not .org, but .gov, you can, and then click on the link for Vermont. It'll give you the listing of all of the projects that they've done dating back for a number of years. And that's good because there's a lot of variety in how you can utilize these funds. And this year they are focusing the money on projects that will improve infrastructure, will improve work opportunities, entrepreneurial opportunities in rural communities. So things like co-working space, maker spaces, those types of activities, collaboratives are all potentially viable. Also, infrastructure projects like broadband deployment is an eligible function under this grant program. Anybody who is a 501c corp and as well as municipalities have the ability to apply for these funds. There is a workshop that will be held to explain how the process works. That will be held in this room on the 20th from 10 to 12. Now, if you're interested in learning about this thing, you want to do that well before that meeting, even though that's a short time period away, because the letter of intent is due on March 29th, 9 days later. The applications are not due until May, but you have to get your letter of intent to be able to apply for it. And there is a process. Everything is done online, so you have to get them to set you up with an account. You have to notify them that you're interested in applying, and then they will give you the account and the password so that you can get on their system to kick in. Yeah, you can kick to the next one. So who can apply? And yeah, and that's where you got to go. It's all in it. Now, this information, if you could kick, I was hoping we could kick this out to people, just because it'll give you the points of contact. But the website is actually pretty comprehensive, and it's getting better. But again, the application and everything's online, so there's not that side of it to look at. But the most important piece that you can get off of the website is that list of projects that have been funded in the past. And that'll be really key in people identifying things that you have going in your community. It needs to be shovel-ready stuff, or it needs to be something where it's specific plans that will drive to something that will occur. And other than that, this is going to be a learning curve for all of us that haven't been participating in this program up till now, because this has been a toy only utilized by the 5 northern counties. Yeah, Brandon.
If a town or a 501c3, as part of their process, would it be okay to work with a private company or not, or is that not?
Yeah, there are.
So in other words, if
say if you're going to do broadband deployment.
That's what I'm saying.
Exactly. That's one where you would partner.
And if I say, well, the town would go in, and can we team with somebody?
Yeah, and generally where you would do in those situations, you would provide funding to a private entity as a loan potentially.
Got it.
But you could put it as a zero interest loan with very favorable terms.
Got it.
So there's a lot of flexibility because it is a grant to you. I know that CVEDC currently has funds that are left over from a prior grant, but that was for broadband deployment. And that money still sits there, so if we had a project, if there was somebody that was looking to do broadband within one of the communities in the region, we could provide funding, and that could be matched, actually used as the match for this funding, because there's separate federal sources for the funds. So, yeah, you can do things in collaboration with private entities, and my understanding is the way I described it, where you would have to do it as a loan. I haven't seen projects where it wasn't done that way, but I'm making that assumption, and it may be possible that you could directly grant money to a provider as well.
Okay.
But we'll get more information as we go. I'm learning as we go here as well. I admit that readily.
The other thing you should know about these funds is while they're federal funds, they're like HUD funds. They lose their federal identity when they come through the state. And so that means your match can be federal funds as long as that federal program gives you permission to match to northern borders. And that's unusual. Usually you can't match federal to federal.
Got it.
Somewhat dependent upon which federal fund sources.
Yep, usually you can't.
Sometimes you can take EDA funds and match them to USDA funds. We've done that in the past. And it seems like you're matching from the same person, but they do. Different entities in the government will play together sometimes. So, it's a short timeline. I think the main thing is we need to get the word out to people quickly about the potential for doing this. There is the possibility of using these funds for housing, for employment housing, particularly where there is a shortage of needed housing for employees, for housing projects. So it's a pretty broad brush where you can apply this.
Jamie, does it include renewable energy projects? I feel like I saw something.
Yeah. My understanding is that it can be for energy efficiency and renewable energy projects as well. So, leading towards economic development. Yeah, and I think that's, in my world, you always end up skewing things, but the reality is that you can make most anything fit economic development if you try hard enough. And there seems to be a significant amount of flexibility. Sometimes it's a problem for me because people want to claim things for economic development that I wouldn't necessarily put there, but in these situations, use the flexibility that we have.
I know there's a group of towns that got together and they formed, I'm trying to think of the name of the 501c3 that they formed. It's something to do with like Central Vermont Fiber.
Internet.
Is it? Yeah.
And is it a C3 or a C6 probably? Which doesn't matter. These grants are available to anybody who's a 501c. It doesn't define whether it's a C3 or a C6. Like regional development corporations, local economic development corporations are generally C6s. We're obviously eligible for this funding.
I was just wondering if anybody here has a.
Yeah, Plainfield is part of that. There are 17 towns that are
Right.
part of that
Woodbury
group.
is.
And, that's actually, the guy who's our representative for that was the person I was going to approach on this.
Well, and I think actually there is some weighting to projects that involve multiple regions, that there is a benefit that you get in the scoring criteria if you have a collaborative process between more than one community.
My question though is, of these towns, do they all have to be within whatever distance that is, or would that?
As the entire state is now included in
Oh,
this,
the
entire state is now part of this Northern Border Region Council. Yep. And that's the big change, is that in the past it was just the top 5 counties, and if you were outside of that, you couldn't play at all. But now it's the entire state.
And the matches are weighted, the distressed communities
Yep.
have a lower match, and Orange County, Berry? I'm trying to think, in our
Yeah.
region, I know Orange, and I think Berry are the 2 distressed communities.
Yep.
Everybody else is eligible, but they have a lower match requirement.
Are these funds available for, does it have to be a shovel-ready, or can it be for planning?
There is some planning, and just to finish, awards require up to a 50% match depending on the level of county economic and demographic distress. Can be used to match for leveraging other grant funds only up to 80% of the total project, and there needs to be a 20% non-federal match. Does it say, let's see now, eligible applicants are for projects that focus on, so this is what the focus is: transportation infrastructure, basic public infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, workforce development, entrepreneurship, and business and technology development, resources and open space conservation, tourism and recreation, renewable and alternative energy. So that's a pretty broad brush that we're working with.
Ron?
And who would I get in touch with? You guys at Economic Development?
You can certainly, if it's, in this region, we certainly would be
Yeah.
one of the points of contact. We don't need necessarily to be part of the application.
I tell our town, somebody to get in touch with.
But yes, use me as a contact, because we're working directly with the person who's at the state, Tim Tierney, who's running this, and if we need to be involved, or if people want us involved, we will be, we'll support them. To what extent we support will be really defined by the people that are looking for application.
What's the deadline for the letter of intent?
That one is, what did I say, that was the 29th?
29th of this month, all right.
Yeah.
You can also tell your towns, certainly Jamie as an economic person is a great lead, the Regional Planning Commission can also work with towns on these projects. We wrote some when we were up in Lamoille County to do some Smuggler's Notch and Lamoille Valley Rail Trail
I'd say,
projects.
especially if it's public infrastructure projects, that really is more of a strength of the planning commission. They deal with that side of it a lot more than we do. And so I think, likely, if that's the direction, if you decide that there's a need
Depends on
for
yeah.
road improvements or something specific to a development project, I would go with the planning commission. But we can,
You've got a lot of us, use us all.
Yeah, and that's really, I think, the point of it, is that, just, if you've got somebody who's interested in your communities, looking into this, have them touch base with either myself or with Bonnie, and we're gonna channel you into the right pieces. That's what it boils down to. That's a lot of what we do is, I don't have to do all the work, but I gotta know the right people to get you to, so you can get it done properly. But
Several communities applied for Vermont outdoor recreation grants, and while the grant announcements aren't being made until Thursday, communities are starting to receive, sorry you didn't get a grant announcements. Those types of projects might be competitive here, because VOREC was outdoor recreation economy that was economically focused.
Yeah, so it's March 29th is the letters of notification, May 10th is the application deadline, July 12th, states finalized scoring, letters provided to the governor's office, 19th, let's see now, where's that? So July 22nd to 26th, the commission will meet and approve the awards. The commission is made up of the governors of the participating states, and they'll, I'm sure, have designated people that make these decisions. But it's the commission that covers the entire northeast section that's covered under this program that decides on all the awards. Then July 29th to August 2nd, they'll make the announcement of the awards. And then after August 2nd, they'll notify those that were unsuccessful. And then signed by August 30th, and awards obligated September 27th. So there's a bit of a timeline to it, but it's a great resource of funds that we haven't had in the past. So it's a new opportunity, and things like walking trails, and I'm thinking about the stuff that's going up in Berrytown with the granite trails that are up there. They've got a 501c3 that they're establishing. It's not a 501c, but with the rock fire stuff, that's the kind of thing that could be supported with these funds that is currently having more difficulty in trying to get the kind of money they need to finish the work. This would be a resource potentially for them. So just think broadly about where the needs are, and maybe that's the place to start, is decide where you have a need that you haven't been able to identify a funding source to, and then bring that. We can take a look at it, and if we need to, happy to fly it up the flagpole with the folks at the state, and just to take a test, see if people potentially would support it. So I don't feel like you have to have a finished thought to be able to begin the conversation. It should be a dialogue.
Jamie, thank you. It's not often that there's a big pot of money with a fair amount that's available for any broad range of things, so it's nice to hear about this. Thank you.
And I'll leave the list there, but again, the list of projects, and they're great for getting people to spur the ideas. All of those projects are available on the website, and all you have to do is just when you go to the main website, click on states, hit Vermont, and it comes up right away. It's listing by date for all the projects for the year. It's right there, so it's really easy to find.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Eileen Pelletier from Downstreet Housing and Community Development. Eileen is the Executive Director there, and welcome to Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission, Eileen.
Thank you. I might need help. Probably needs, we'll see if it's. Just turn myself off.
We'll do the same with you, and we'll tag team things.
All right, let me just test it. Okay, it actually looks like it's working. All right, we're good.
So again, where am I gonna stand here? I wanna be able to see everybody. Does this sort of work?
Yep.
Am I blocking too much? Okay. So good evening, everyone. Once again, I'm Eileen Pelletier. I'm the Executive Director at Downstreet Housing and Community Development, and we provide affordable housing primarily in Washington County, but also in Orange and Lamoille County for home ownership. And I thought what we'd do tonight is, I almost have sort of two presentations here, and I hear that you are a talkative, interruptive, questioning group, and that's great. So I'm going to tell you what the two sort of topics are, and you can decide, where you want to focus your attention. So the first part is just sort of who we are, focused through the lens of our most recent strategic plan. Which was a pretty big shift for us, so sort of sharing that. And then the second conversation is I serve on the Governor's Opioid Coordination Council, and Downstreet is taking the lead with the work related to the rapid response for the need for housing for people in recovery. So we can spend some time talking about that as well. I know that's a topic that affects all kinds of communities. So please, interrupt and we'll start right in. So I thought I would start sort of with our core values. So Downstreet believes that everyone deserves a home. That's kind of a given one. But the second one is that there is power in community. And this was, so we are a community, what's called a community development corporation. So our mission is both to provide affordable housing, but to build communities as well. And what we've come to realize through 30 years of doing this, we're celebrating our 32nd year, is that we really want to both understand the challenge that can be that power in community, so power can be positive and negative, understand the negative side of it, and harness the positive side of it. So we really approached our strategic plan a year ago with that lens in mind. And you'll hear me talk a lot about power in community, and I think it fits really well with this group. So we value, quality, encourage, both in our own work and the people that we're working with, both our residents, our homeowners, and our communities. Human dignity, Vermont small communities, and rural character, a healthy planet, and a great workplace. So when we looked at our mission statement already.
I already have a question.
Go.
When it says everyone deserves a home, what is that? How about, does it mean everyone will take care of the home? Is it like in terms of public housing? Is this private?
It's not.
I'm just kind of trying to figure out how not everyone takes care of the homes that they're given to them.
Yeah, that's true. I wouldn't say they were given to them. We believe that everyone deserves to have a home to start from. That is a core value.
Okay.
It was interesting, the whole idea of healthcare as a human right. Our board had a lot of conversation about whether housing is a human right.
I would
We didn't
imagine.
go that far. We sort of landed with everyone deserves a home.
Right.
So we believe they deserve it. There's obviously lots to talk about within that, and you'll probably hear me talk about some of those things. So when we were looking at our mission statement, so when I started this job 11 years ago, if you asked what Downstreet Housing was, people would say, oh, like that building, and you sort of know the sign, and at that time it was actually Central Vermont Community Land Trust, so people may know us as CVCLT. But today, we much more think about strengthening the communities of Central Vermont by engaging with people, so much more, engaging with people across the communities, not just the people in our housing, providing affordable housing, and that's our bread and butter. We say that we're infrastructure experts, so both for residential housing, but also in buildings. So, we work with people in communities around trying to address vacant buildings or, an old historic building, what can we do with it? We do those kinds of things. And we connect people to the resources and services they need to thrive. So during our strategic planning process, at one point, one of my board members stood up and said, it was actually quite a dynamic conversation. They were all pacing around the room, and he said, 4 walls and a roof just isn't enough. And that was kind of an aha moment for everybody in the room. He said, yeah, you're right. We can't sort of rest on our laurels and say, all right, you got the housing, and this sort of speaks to what you were saying. Sorry, I can't see your name because your hat's in the way, but it speaks to that. Like, it isn't enough. So what we need to do is provide services to help people thrive, and that may be about learning how to take care of a home better. There's many aspects to services. So we basically have 4 strategic goals, and I'm going to skip right over this because we're going to go into a little bit of detail, and I'm going to highlight just a few of these, and if one of these boxes really sort of tweaks your interest and you want me to talk about it, feel free to, say, tell me more about the purple box or whatever. But so one of our first strategic goals is essentially to provide access to a full range of housing options in our service area. So full range meaning everything from collaborations with providers who are running shelters, trying to address our homeless crisis that we have in the state, and it is still a crisis and it is growing, and to some degree that is related to the opioid crisis that we're experiencing in the state of Vermont and really across the world, not even just across the country. So we collaborate, partner with them. In central Vermont, we typically use a lot of partnerships with service providers like Washington County Mental Health or the Family Center or the Youth Service Bureau, all those different kinds of partnerships. We don't tend to want to build a big building where we're going to put everybody who who maybe has a mental health issue in one building, because we recognize the rural nature of our area. So in Burlington, there are, tends to be more of those kinds of projects. We tend to shy away from that. So a lot of our housing, which we have about 500 apartments, a fair amount of that has sort of understandings with, for example, Washington County Mental Health, where we collaborate. We allow, somebody is in our apartment and we allow Washington County Mental Health to provide those services. So it's a really strong partnership. It allows someone to be successful in a rental situation where they might not be in another situation because, they have mental health challenges. They need that additional support. So whether it's addressing homelessness or what I was just really describing is a permanent supportive housing model. When we look at, I think one of the things we don't want to realize about our state and our country is that there are a lot of people who have substantial challenges against them, and it isn't just financial. There are people who have physical and mental disabilities. We have an aging state. You probably all have talked about that. I think we're number 2 now behind Maine. So those make things more challenging for people. So we really need to think about how are those people going to thrive. 4 walls and a roof is not enough. So connecting to services for those populations. So that's kind of what the brown one is speaking to, and we do that through a lot of those small agreements with a variety of different players. One example I want to mention there that we're trying to do that is an innovative project is we're doing a tiny house project in Berry City. We just renamed it, and I forget what we call it, but it's not called a tiny house, because it's not like the thing on wheels, that's $30,000 that you see on TV. Yeah. It's kind of like a souped-up version of that that's much more permanent on a slab, but it's that size. It's 340 square feet. We're doing it in collaboration with Norwich University, amazing architect department. We've got like 25 students and 2 architecture professors working with us, and they have designed it. And now this spring session, they're actually building the first one. And the reason we're looking at that is twofold. One, you probably all have heard affordable housing is pretty expensive to build. So we can't address the challenge in this state, and I'll talk about how it is still very challenging, and there's still a deep need for affordable housing by the normal mechanisms that we've worked under. So we have to try new things. So this a tiny house is about 20% of the cost of what it would be to build, like maybe many of you are familiar with our project in Berry City on Summer Street that we did probably 3 years ago. That's sort of our traditional project, or we did South Main Apartments in Waterbury in 2015. Those projects are expensive, and we can't do as many of those, and we certainly can't do them in many of the small communities that you all are representing. There's challenges to that, largely because we can't get to scale. I mean, at the end of the day, the biggest challenge in Vermont to do affordable housing is probably the scale issue. When I go talk to my colleagues around the country, they're doing developments that are, 100 apartments. And I say, oh, well, I just did one that's, 30 units, and they think we're crazy. Because it just does, how can you possibly do that? 30 units doesn't work, how can you make that work? And that's why we layer all this funding in, and we need community support. I mean, Steve's familiar with this. It's a big collaboration of, getting the town to provide some financial support we often use 10, 12 different funding sources to do it, and it's largely related to that challenge. of scale. So that's kind of speaking to the blue one. So that's our bread and butter, is providing affordable housing to people at 30 to 80% area median income. So that's pretty low income. 30% is considered very low income. But we have a lot of people in the state who are at that income level. Many of them because of those reasons I just described. We also have a lot of people who are at 80%, and they may be, many of our residents, most of our residents are employed, have full-time jobs, may have 2 jobs. And I did, testify last week, and somebody said to me, "So you've been doing this for a while, why do we still have a problem?" I was ready for it. So I said, well, I think there's 2 reasons. And I said, not that I'm like a super liberal, but Bernie is definitely right sometimes. And the reality is the rich are getting richer, and there are more people dropping into these lower income levels. We know that. And the second reason, in addition to the income levels, people dropping into that income levels, is this opioid crisis that we are dealing with. It's affecting things. And I am well aware of the fact. In fact, in the past year, I've sort of been sitting around thinking, I've been doing this for 10 years, and it feels like the problem is worse. And in fact, we are seeing that it is worse. It's growing. So that's why we're doing things like tiny houses and working on recovery residences and trying to look at this like through a different lens instead of just continuing to do our bread and butter. But that doesn't mean there isn't still a very big need for our bread and butter, and I'll show a slide a little bit later that sort of shows some challenging data around why that is still important to do the regular housing.
Talk a little bit about the purple box.
Sure. So today, when we think about so area median income is the average, right? People at 80 to 150% of area median income still can very much be struggling to pay the rent. Federal programs are that 30 to 80%, right? So that's how we used to think about it. Oh, we have to help that population. And there's still a very big need for that population. But we can't, my board said, we can't ignore all these people who are working hard and are, one paycheck away, one car broken down, that means they can't get to work and then they lose the job from everything falling apart. So looking at programs where we can fund people from 80 to 150. So our current governor likes to use the term workforce housing. I don't like that term because, as I just said, many of the people in this other box are working. So, it sort of suggests that anybody who's at that lower income isn't working. But anyways, the 80 to 150 is trying to get at those people who, are a little bit higher income but are still really struggling. And there's a lot of people in the state in that box. So many of you might be familiar with the housing revenue bond that was passed in Governor Scott's first term. That part of that money, 25% of that $37 million went towards this category, which was really exciting because we never have money to serve this population. We never have money to, help people get into rental or home ownership at that level. So my project in Montpelier that is under construction on Taylor Street, there are 30 apartments under construction right now. 11 of those are going to serve that. Is actually 80 to 120, whatever the mechanism ended up being. This is what we wanted it to be. The governor's funding was 80 to 120. So they'll serve 80 to 120. So that is great because we get so many applicants who are kind of right on the edge or maybe at 100% and really would do well and thrive. And really all they need is that assistance, around housing, and everything else in their life is kind of working. Let's make sure they stay, stable and have adequate housing. So 11 of those units of the 30 will actually serve that population. Not nearly enough of that money, but.
Is the area based on the municipality or the county or what? The area income?
It's by county, and it's actually federally defined, and it determines how much, subsidy is available for the individual or for the property owner as they're trying to run. The funding sources are all defined by that, and it changes annually, so it's redone annually. Yes?
How does Habitat for Humanity fit into this?
So there are many providers of affordable housing in the state. Habitat is one of them. We partner a lot with them. particularly around, I'll talk about it a little bit later, but on the home ownership side. Why don't I just leave it at that? Well, I'll come back and talk about Habitat when I get to the slide that talks about our home ownership programs. This is primarily talking about the rental side of things, but we partner with them. One of my staff has been on their board for a long time, and we all try to work together and do some good work here. So I'm going to come back to that home ownership thing again. Oops, went the wrong way. Okay, this is the one I thought you might find interesting. So this is getting at, I said, infrastructure is our expertise and everybody has a vision, okay, an apartment. What we really want to talk about and expand, this goal is a little bit of a stretch for us, I think, is this idea of providing places and access to resources that address community need, build connectedness, and promote well-being. So this is, again, getting at that 4 walls and a roof are not enough. So I will say when we are looking at rental development, one of the core tenets of community development corporations is that we respond to the community need. So we don't go into a community and go, hey, there's a nice piece of land and we're going to build some housing there. And we always talk to the community and hear whether or not the community is thinking, either sometimes they come and say, we've got this space and we don't know what to do with it. Sometimes they say, we're hearing from everybody that there isn't enough housing, how can you help us? So it's always a collaboration, and we have strong partnerships, primarily with our larger communities, not as much with the smaller communities on the rental side because of the scale issue, but we certainly have, when we get to home ownership, probably in all of your towns, we have some home ownership connections there.
Is in terms of, is it false to think that there are apartments, houses that could be rented in our central Vermont area that are not rented because of the situation that people who rent can sometimes get into with people, in terms of it take at least 6 months to get somebody not paying to move out, and you got to give them heat and electricity? I have a feeling.
No, that is not a false statement at all.
Okay,
it's a very accurate statement.
Yeah, my company, we have a building on the corner, and I won't rent it because I know what might happen.
Right. It's a big challenge.
Yeah, okay, I just wanted to find out.
I would say Berry City is where we see it the most. So I'm going to show a slide at some point where it says, the vacancy rate is essentially 0 in this state. But there are properties that are offline, and those properties are offline because landlords have had a bad experience. So one of our aspirations, I was just having this conversation the other day with Rep. LeClaire from Barry Town about, and he's giving a personal story about, trying to support a resident he had, and it goes bad, and it ends up costing a lot of money to repair the apartment, and what can we do about that? So I think there's an opportunity for affordable housing providers like Downstreet, and there are 11 of groups sort of like me across the state. Not everybody does the home ownership side, but there are a lot of players in this arena to collaborate with landlords to maybe provide some of that assistance around. So I think we are we have a certain level of technical expertise, both on landlord-tenant law and, dealing with all the legal side of it, but also in supporting and training people and trying to help people not trash the apartment, to be blunt about it, right? That is a program that I aspire to do, but haven't really kind of gotten around to doing yet, I have to be honest. But it's definitely a challenge. And it would be unlikely at this point for me to go back into Berry City and do another big building without addressing that. I mean, in fact, when I did the project in Berry City, I worked a lot with Mayor Lozon, and we both were like, we got to do one, we got to make a statement, we got to fix this really bad spot in Berry. I'm going to put my offices there and sort of make a statement, like try to change the community a little bit. But the next thing we need to do is figure out that issue. So this was like a really interesting conversation by my board about, kind of picture it's like the 1830s and the town green, and there's houses all around, right? And there's places where people can gather and have a conversation, and they're not like looking at their cell phone, right? It was really this sort of idea of like, remember when. And I sort of go, yeah, when you could borrow the cup of sugar, sort of the good part of the 1950s, but without all the sort of racism and all the other isms, that were happening in those days. That connectedness, that sense of community. And I think all of you in sort of the smaller towns around Central Vermont, you still have that. You know, I think in, you know, the Barrys and Montpeliers, it's still there. And I mean, I grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and, you know, they probably have less of it than, you know, Barry's not really a city, I guess, in my view of things. But I think there's something that can be harnessed there. And, you know, I've often thought in working with different communities, small communities, I worked with East Montpelier for a long time around, they wanted to develop a big senior housing building, and I kept saying, it's going to be really hard to do. What if you looked at, you know, a program where people checked on each other? And there are programs around the country that you all may have heard about for seniors where you can provide that sort of community support and connection. So in our housing, we're trying to look at providing physical spaces for that to happen. So we're thinking more about green spaces, we're thinking more about community spaces. In our Barry office, we have a very large community space that is available to nonprofits, and I would encourage Bonnie to have a meeting there some Tuesday night. You know, it's available. It's a great space. It's probably twice the size of this, and it's used all the time by our community partners. So trying to think through that lens. Yes.
I've been very impressed with your property at Evergreen Place, and the fact that it has a senior center and a kitchen. The kitchen draws so many people together. They have a wonderful breakfast program that people of all ages come to. And I just wonder how other properties in central Vermont, if there are ones that incorporate a community kitchen like that.
Right. I mean, so in our space in Barry, we have that, and it's a riot. Now, you might think, there was a training in there today, it was Marlborough College was using the space. There's probably 30 people in there. And you normally, right, you think, oh, they have a catered lunch. Nobody caters the lunch. When they know there's a kitchen, it's potluck. So there's the crock pots and the, you know, the baked goods, and it's so Vermonty when I see this. It does. I mean, a kitchen draws people, and it's really fun. I have a decaf coffee problem. I don't drink regular coffee, but I'm always in there getting more decaf, and I'm just fascinated by how people interact, and they gather around food. So, I mean, they're expensive, right? So you have to make it work. You have to go out and get, when we got our space funded through National Life gave us a big grant for that space, so we're allowed, you know, able to share it. So, Steve.
Well, we have a building in downtown Waterbury, some of you may be familiar with Stimson and Graves building, that has our senior center and kitchen, and the way they make it work is that they do the Meals on Wheels program and the free lunch in the summer. So they're teamed up with our recreation program, and they're actually really growing out of the space. But it's true that those kinds of programs really can
and
work
we own
well.
That building too.
So they have an infusion of funding to do that.
Yep.
So that's the other thing. They're implementing a program with federal food funding for Meals on Wheels, which may occur in
right.
some
So
other
again, that's
communities.
the partnerships and the collaborations, and right now I'm trying to figure out how to. I'm thinking about a new project, and I really want to do a childcare, you know, affordable childcare, which is going to require different funders, like CVMC or Blue Cross Blue Shield. I'm imagining, you know, there's partners.
I'll put my hand up because I was curious about, I mean, there's an overlap between what Dara mentioned and just have you, that's sort of moving over into the co-housing territory. Do you guys think about that at all? Do you go, is that it seems like in Vermont it's a very unaffordable housing option, but there's a logic to it.
Yeah, there is a logic to it. And so, I mean, personally, I almost moved into a co-housing several times in my life. So I'm personally drawn to it, and I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do an affordable version of it. And I'm not going to say it's impossible, but the funding doesn't really line up well to do it. So, you know, I've worked with, well, there's the group in East Montpelier and Plainfield that's been sort of thinking about it. I talked to the people in Montpelier, the people in Bristol co-housing that just got commuted. My best friends just moved there. They have a few units that will be affordable, and so there is a mechanism to do that, but to do a whole project that we developed is challenging, and they tend to be super expensive, and part of that is because they're you know, wanting to meet a lot of things. So they're trying to meet all of our values, right? You know, the green planet, you know, affordable, and those sometimes conflict with each other. But it's something we're still interested in playing with, but I haven't been able to figure it out yet. It's a challenge. Yep.
Using economic stratification within the housing.
Yeah.
You know, where you have several units at different prices.
Income levels. Yeah, so I actually will say, so pretty much all of our properties have some level of that. So like French Block is a good example. We just completed that in December. So there are 18 units, 5 served previously homeless, 5 are market rate affordable to anyone, you know, anybody can, no income restriction at all, and then the other 8 are in that like 30 to 80 range. So that's like our ideal, but it comes down to the sort of available financing and the cost of the project and how much the community can put in to make that mix work. And on the home ownership side, it's even more challenging than on the rental side.
Oh, okay.
So that's part of the reason it's challenging. Just briefly want to mention SASH, Support and Services at Home, which is a collaboration, a statewide collaboration of affordable housing partners that work with a variety of different service providers to provide population health and person-centered care to people who are Medicare eligible, so elderly and young disabled. It's a national model. It's being replicated by Housing and Urban Development all over the country. A couple of states are trying to do it themselves. It's primarily paid through Medicare dollars, and the idea behind it is we're providing services, service coordination to elderly and young disabled. We make an investment in their preventive health so that we save Medicare dollars on the other end, and we know that we save about $1,200 a year per participant, which is pretty phenomenal. So Medicare is very happy with that program, and we have a goal of expanding that to families in Vermont. So right now, again, it was like the first funding source available was Medicare. We convinced them to try this. Now we'd like to develop that program for families as well. I think I'm going to move us on to then talk a little bit about homeownership, where I think there's a little more connection to some of the smaller communities. So our homeownership programs, we have several different things that we do. We do a lot of financial coaching. We coach first-time homebuyers. We provide quite a lot of different down payment assistance programs, the biggest one being our shared equity program. And I think, here I'm looking around, I think pretty much every single town probably has at least a few shared equity homes. So these are essentially homes that an individual goes through a home buyer education program. They income qualify, meaning they're at no higher than 120% area median income, and they qualify for a down payment assistance grant, which is essentially the down payment, the 20%. And with that, they're able to buy the home. They work with us. We work both on sort of, you know, this is how you pay your mortgage, this is how you think about your capital needs for the long term, pay your taxes, all of those things. And they are sort of part of our portfolio of homes. This is the core community land trust model, which we could spend a whole nother time talking about, but we have 165 of those around central Vermont. And some of you who are familiar with what happens on your tax side probably are familiar with them, because so some of them are, it's sort of, it's essentially secured through a covenant agreement, so that's part of the deed documents. And when they go to resell that home, so in 10 years they're doing well, they're ready for a bigger home, they actually share the appreciation in the home. So 75% of the appreciation in the home, the increase in the value, comes back to Downstreet. They get 25%. And when we take it back, we add it to the home. So the grant, you know, maybe it was a $100,000 home, it was originally 20. The grant then becomes a $28,000 grant, maintaining that permanent affordability of that home in the community. So that's sort of the very simple version of what is a very complex model, which is now utilized all around the world and was really started right here in Burlington, Vermont. So we're actually the second largest community land trust in the world with our 165 homes. So that's one of the things we do, a lot of financial wellness. And so through this process, we identified a few things. One of the things we definitely identified is we are hearing more and more about college debt, student loan debt, a lot of heads nodding.
Parent plus students.
we actually, and I've, had some conversations with the bank and with like Northfield Savings Bank about this, and we're a little worried that this is the next housing crisis, because we have a lot of young people who are not going to be able to afford to buy this very large stock of single-family homes around the state of Vermont that we know from a significant study done in 2015 called the Bowen Report, says what we already know, that the quality of our housing stock is about a C minus. So not only are the homes challenging to be affordable for someone who has a lot of college debt, even if you can afford the mortgage, you actually go into that home and, right off the bat, you got to come up with $40,000, $50,000, $80,000 to make it livable. So Downstreet is collaborating with Housing Vermont on what we're calling the Neighborhood Housing Program. We only have approval for 8 homes right now, but we're trying to prove to the state and to the funders that we should buy some of these homes that are, on the market, invest in them now, and then attach a grant to them like that program I just described, but a larger grant. And then basically keep them in that program, address the capital needs now. So address energy efficiency, fix the roof if it needs fixing, and basically try to look at the capital needs for the next decade and meet all of them up front. And we call it total cost of ownership. So it's really both reducing the total cost of ownership because we're addressing energy efficiency, so the operating costs are better, but we're also addressing a bunch of capital needs, allowing an individual to then build the capital so in year 11 when the roof needs to be replaced, they can afford it. So we're doing a lot of work in helping people understand sort of the total cost of owning a home so that they can be successful in doing it. In the old days, we'd say, oh yeah, you can afford the mortgage, go be happy, and it worked sometimes and it didn't work a lot of times. So that's another kind of innovative program we're trying to develop for me personally, and I'm sort of the sort of one, I guess, the affordable housing person in the state who talks most about the small towns and like, what the heck are we doing there? We have to do something. And I think that is potentially a program that is going to help some of the small communities who you all know when you drive down Main Street of whatever town, there are homes that have been kind of sitting there, or there are homes that need work. What kind of program can we do to start to address that? So another program that we do have is called our Revolving Loan Fund Program. I'm guessing most of you are familiar with that. It's a program that provides grants and loans, and the loans can be 0% deferred, meaning you're not making a payment on it until you sell it to the next person, for emergency problems. So if you have somebody in your town whose boiler stopped working and they're low income, call us. We're able to quickly get some money in there, grant, loan, whatever it takes to help somebody with those kind of repairs, roof leaks. The challenge with that money is we often we have some flexible money, emergency money for like the real emergency, like it's Tuesday morning and it's 30 below and it's a single mom with 3 kids. This is a true story. Last year and the heat stopped working and we got a new furnace in 3 days. But primarily we look at the whole home. So if you call about the roof, but we go in and you have no water, we have to address the water too, because you all know how federal money works. And obviously that's the right thing to do. So it can become somewhat challenging because we're looking at a lot of issues. But certainly that's a program that you all should be aware of. So, on the home ownership side, I think this is the area where we can do more in some of our small communities. But I will say it's the most challenging money to get at. So there is a state organization, Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, which is the money that comes from our property transfer tax, funds both conservation and housing, and they are trying to balance what is a strong need on the rental side with trying to also do home ownership. And I think we need more for both, but I certainly think we need more on the home ownership side. And this neighborhood housing program that we're piloting hopefully will make that point that it's a worthwhile investment. So investing $60,000 or $70,000 in a home that's already there versus building a new rental, might make sense. So I'm going to pretty much skip this one, but this is just our sort of like our organizational one. We're a great place to work. We are financially healthy, and that's really important because we steward a portfolio of about $85 million worth of properties around central Vermont. So when the shift happened a few years back with the president, and I wondered if we would have, you know, any ability to do our work in 60 days. I was like, we need to be a solid organization. I mean, I had always had that goal, but I sort of redoubled my efforts to make sure that, because our first and foremost, we have to steward that portfolio of 500 apartments and 164 homes. So, you know, there's just some different things around this, but that's, oops. Okay. So just a really quick slide on this. There's a few big ones here. So Vermont has the 5th largest rental housing affordability gap in the nation. That means how much money you make versus how much it costs to have an apartment. The gap between those two, we are the 5th worst in the country. I say this and I say it like that because people tend to think like Vermont is so idyllic, and we have some real challenges. And on the opioid side, we're number 1 in one category. So, you know, we have some real issues happening. Here's your vacancy rate number. Look at that in 94, 10.6%, you know, basically 1% on the rental side. The units that I kind of administer essentially are 0. You know, 1,300 people homeless in January of 18, almost 300 of them children, and then I mentioned the high total cost of home ownership. So that's kind of like who we are, and I know I only have 5 minutes left, so I think I will just sort of really quickly talk about the opioid challenge that we're faced with. And I'm going to skip this, I'm going to prioritize here. Maybe I missed the slide I want to go to. So basically what we know, and we are about to release a report, the governor is going to do a press conference in about a week and a half. That was just confirmed today, so you're hearing that before anybody else. But what we know is that we have a big problem with substance use disorder in this state. We're second only to the District of Columbia in the number of people who are in treatment. Now that can be a good and bad thing, because we actually have a pretty strong network of treatment. We need to do more on the prevention side. We need to do more on the recovery side. And what I want to say about this basically is that, so there's a lot of work that we're doing around identifying the need for homes for people in recovery, which are essentially sober living environments. So long story short, you go into recovery, you make that really difficult decision, you present at the emergency room. Today, if you do that, you will get medication in the ER at CVMC, which is amazing. You will get into treatment within 72 hours, which is also amazing nationally. And then you will spend 21 days in treatment, which isn't long enough, but you'll at least have 21 days, and then you're back out on the streets. And this is a story I heard recently in St. Johnsbury in the middle of a snowstorm. This individual goes through this, challenging journey, comes out literally on the streets in the middle of a snowstorm. Now there are programs and there are things, but there is a big hole where recovery residences should be in the state of Vermont. For whatever reason, and I think there's lots of reasons. I think some of it is sort of the landlord and the legal thing around substance use disorder. We don't partner with them in the same way we do with mental health, so we're trying to fix that. We know that we probably need 15 to 20 recovery homes around the state of Vermont, like yesterday. This report's pretty shocking. I mean, you can see this. There's 11,000 people in treatment, and there's 205 beds in the state. Now, not all 11,000 people want to go into a sober living environment, but a lot more than 205 do. There are certain communities that are just don't have anything. Rutland has nothing. Rutland, which is dealing with a very big opioid crisis, has no recovery residences. So, lots of work happening on that. But the thing that I want to mention to all of you is that, when we think about substance use disorder, note my words. I'm not saying substance abuse. I'm saying substance use. We know today, and at the Opioid Coordination Council last week, we had a professor from UVM Medical Center basically talking about the brain chemistry of substance use disorder. And, our Attorney General, our Commissioner of Health, Mark Levine, this professor, but how we should be thinking about substance use disorder is no different than how we should be thinking about diabetes. And I think it's really difficult for people to make that shift, but the science is there. And, I actually said in a meeting last week, when we looked at this number of about 35% of people in prison today in the state of Vermont have substance use disorder. And I said, so basically, we're gonna start putting people in jail for eating cupcakes? Like, that's the analogy, right? Now, that's a little extreme, but that's how we need to think about this. It is a disease, not different from a chronic disease like diabetes, and it needs chronic management. So the biggest thing that I think you all can do in this conversation is, in recovery, we need a lot of things. We need housing, we need employment, we need transportation. So lots of things happening to make all that, but what we need more than anything is that power of community, that strong, supportive community that understands that this is a disease. This is a long-term disease that you never really recover from, right? It is a lifelong journey, and at this stage, we are now talking about multiple generations of people hopefully living in recovery. We have, we have children of parents who are in DCF. We have grandparents caring for individuals who are still using or in recovery. This is something that is going to be with us for multiple generations. And we need, the biggest thing that I think we can do is not all about federal funds or programs or building infrastructure. It's about changing our attitude and taking that stigma away. I worked in HIV/AIDS for a very long time, and at the end of the day, what I realized was the most powerful thing that we could do was to be a supportive community. So I would encourage you all to sort of learn more about the science of substance use disorder. There's some great presentations around the language. We did this with our staff, and it was incredibly powerful to realize that my staff, who are a bunch of, well-meaning individuals, all realizing that they were, exacerbating the problem by their language of how they even talked about our own residents. So I think there's a lot to learn, and I think communities play a really critical role in this. And I'm going to be speaking at the Vermont Community Development Association meeting in May. Probably some of you attend that, where we'll have like a whole hour to talk about opioids and the substance use disorder challenge. So only a couple minutes over. I'll stop there.
Really interesting. We've got time for just a couple of questions, but does anybody have a question for Eileen?
My small town had a situation where I was introduced to what happens when houses fall into foreclosure.
Yes, I know about
which
this
is,
in Greenfield.
Just so everybody understands, it's a scam and a scandal, because what happens is and these are properties that I had a lot of buyers lined up for. They have these fake auctions. Let's say a house is worth $20,000. They have these fake auctions, and the auction start at $80,000. And then they close the auction because nobody's bidding. And then the house disappears, and they do it because the banks can collect insurance money if the house didn't sell at a high price. I shamed them into selling a house at a reasonable price. But our community was sitting there with these empty houses in the middle of all this crisis. And I just think that they're really, and I've talked to the legislators about it, but I just don't know if you're aware of, I mean, there are these houses that are sitting, and the banks are playing these games, and it goes on and on and on.
I'm well aware of it, and it is a super challenging situation. There, I know, actually Mayor Lozon spent a lot of time, this is Berry City, I don't know, they were just talking about 50 homes in the city right now.
And
Not all
the
quit at
auctioneers are
foreclosure,
getting a
but-
check, and the lawyers are getting a check, and the community sits and bears the brunt of it.
And it's a lot of federal stuff that allows all this to happen. So he was trying to figure out, actually with Governor Scott, like, is there some legislation that we could pass that could move this along? Because what happens is, eventually, after everybody gets paid, it does get freed up. But in the meantime, you have the home sitting there for 2 years.
2.5, 3
Yeah,
years.
yeah.
That I could have gotten a decent buyer on, and at the price that it ended up going for, and it would have been a rehabilitated, and it was a blight on our small little village.
Yeah, and I think, when the foreclosure crisis started, that wasn't happening to the degree that it's happening now, because I am on camera here, but I think they sort of figured out how to manage the system, right? The banks, initially they were like, whoa, we've got all these foreclosed homes, we've got to move them along. And it was still a beastly process, but I think in some ways it's gotten worse. And certainly, That's not uncommon, what you're describing.
For a small town, you know, these properties were in central locations.
I know exactly which
Just-
homes you're talking about.
Yeah.
Laura?
So just quickly, do you ever partner with employers to provide affordable housing in the area where they're located? I mean, I know there are some bigger employers that I can think of that maybe their employees do not make enough money to, you know, buy a house or afford the rent in the area. So it seems like it would be to their benefit to try to
Partner.
at least provide something.
So one of the challenges, so we do that. A great example is our property Willow Brook in Warren was a collaboration with Sugarbush. That actually predates me. But when that project was done, so there's some real challenges with that because there's federal funding, right? So the income level is a little too low for most of the people who are working there. And then the seasonal employee thing is a big challenge just because federal funding requires that you sign a year lease. So, you know, we've really struggled. I mean, the property's doing okay now, but we really struggled. But the idea of that was workforce housing. So sometimes it's not a great fit because of the income level. And certainly there's seasonality, but we're always, you know, sort of open to that conversation, but we don't, that's probably the only time we did sort of a direct with one employer.
Okay.
And I just briefly, I forgot, Alan, that I did not go back to Habitat for Humanity. So you know, their model is a little bit like that shared equity model I was describing, but they have sort of, you know, sweat equity as well added into it. So we often will assist with sort of the financial mechanisms behind that for them and provide some assistance around that. But our model is not to do the sort of sweat equity thing, although I think it's great, it's just not where we focus.
Eileen, can you talk about your third and fifth bullet on the one that's up there, the disproportionate amount of recovery home beds reserved for men when,
Yeah.
and then the Chittenden County proportion.
So the
as well.
recovery residents that exist today are really in classic Vermont style, have evolved sort of organically. I mean, some of them are like someone was in recovery, you know, they did really well, they recognized that, you know, they converted their home into a recovery residence. So there's a lot of work around certifying and how we're going to do this to scale. But so there was no sort of logic to it. And women and children is a newer population, so that's part of it as well. But also it is a lot harder to run a recovery residence for single women with children than to run one for men. So I've heard that feedback. So when we came out with that and we said, all right, you guys are all got to start running these, and they were like, you know, it's a completely different thing. So there are, you know, there's one in the state that's private, and then Lund Family Center runs one, but that's a big shift in need. And, you know, hopefully some of those are going to allow women to get their children back that are in DCF custody, because that's a huge challenge right now.
And then
that was the third and
the
fifth.
Chittenden County.
Oh.
Is that a historic artifact too, or?
Yeah, it's just where does it work, right? And where is there more people? It wasn't. So this report that is coming out in a week and a half literally goes, we looked at every single community where there is what's called the hub, which is where people get treatment, medicated assisted treatment or MAT, and said, you know, what is the need around that community? So with the opioid crisis, most people, not everybody, but need daily treatment, right? So you need to be with it, be able to get to that treatment, you need to be able to get to a job and to a home. So when we look at that, we see that there are areas like Rutland where there is a treatment center and no housing. So we want to, you know, have that closer together. So yeah, it's kind of a relic of the sort of organic evolution of it to date. And I'm actually the vice chair of what's called VTAR Vermont Alliance of Recovery Residences, which will take the responsibility for certifying these homes, because now there is no certification process. There is legislation working its way through right now related to zoning, you know, so that this all sort of becomes an above, not that it was, you know, anything bad was said, but, you know, that there's a process and a way to do it. If we're going to go from 200 just sort of scattered around the state to, tripling that number in a short period of time. We want to have more of a system approach to it, which hasn't existed to date.
Are there zoning issues?
Just so how you would zone it, group home versus a single-family home?
Like
So-
number of units?
Right, yeah.
Okay.
So there's some clarification around that. And then there's also a need to have, so it's a sober living environment. If a person is using, we can't fall under landlord-tenant law and have someone using, I mean, the whole point is to have a safe environment for everybody, so we have to be able to have somebody removed. So legislation to be able to do that, so, there's always a million details to this stuff, but.
Oh, yeah, no, I was saying, I know for homeless funding, Chittenden County applies to the federal government separately from the rest
Yes,
of the state.
There's no funding in any of those.
Yeah, oh, I see.
They're all privately run. A lot of them are, getting donations from
I see.
people. I mean, one of the things about substance use disorder is it affects everybody. There's no economic, so many of these are not, we know that, that one, yeah, no, it isn't in there. 75% of people with substance use disorder are are low income. So they're not getting into those homes for the most part. They are in some places. There are certainly homes that will just take anyone and use their donations, they just make it work, but there isn't like federal funding supporting it or state funding for the most part supporting it.
Eileen, thank you very much for telling us about Downstreet and also bringing this particular issue of substance use disorder and the various sort of housing issues associated with it to our attention. It's very interesting.
Well, thank you for having me. And I
Thank you.
am going to sneak out because I've got my college-aged kids home for spring break for a couple days.
Do you have a home left?
They're girls, I think I'm good.
Oh, well,
That was an inappropriate generalization.
that's a little sexist.
So next up on the agenda is the 2019 nominating committee appointments. We were going to do this last month, but we needed to cancel because of the storm. And so we need to do it this month. And there's a memo on page 8 that just sort of reminds you what the nominating committee does, but the nominating committee is typically 3 people who are tasked with coming up with a slate of candidates to serve as officers and on the executive committee. And our current bylaws are a little vague about just how the nominating committee gets formed, but traditionally we have done this as nominations from the floor. Nominations do not require a motion, and you don't have to have a second for nominations, but so we will. Nominations are now in order for the nominating committee. And do we have any nominations? Dara?
I'd like to nominate Byron Atwood, Bob Warnicki, and Alan Quackenbush.
Okay, and are these 3 people willing to serve? I'm saying yes, I'm saying yes, and yes, okay. So we have 3 nominations. Are there any further nominations for the nominating committee?
It's okay.
Robert's rule says I have to ask a couple more times, so I will. We have 3 nominations. Are there any further nominations for the nominating committee? And hearing no further nominations, then if you have no objections, nominations are closed. If it's okay with you, I would suggest that we do this on a vote for all 3 together. So those who are in favor of appointing Byron Atwood, Bob Warnick, and Alan Quackenbush to the nominating committee, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you very much. We appreciate your willingness to serve. The ayes have it.
Just as a technical thing, just so it's all okay, I don't know if anybody seconded the motion.
Don't need to do seconds
Don't need
for,
to, okay, great, no, just.
so this works as an election.
Thank you.
Just throw one little cog in there.
So last night I pulled out my copy and read it. The bylaws allow the nominating committee normally 2 months, from February to April, to come up with a slate, and it's a little hard to do it in 1 month. So I am asking the board if you are willing to extend the process out a month so that we'd have the slate in May, and we would do the elections at a rescheduled annual meeting in June. And so that way there's enough time for the nominating committee to do their work. And I'm hoping somebody will make a motion to this effect.
So moved. Second?
So we have a motion by Byron, and it was seconded, was that you, Peter?
Yes.
Okay, seconded by Peter Kirby. All in favor of extending this schedule out a month, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? So that passes too. Thank you very much. Next up, we have Nancy. Nancy gets to present. Nancy is going to talk to us about the Board of Commissioners surveys.
Nancy, do you need any button pusher person?
No, it should be office.
So while Nancy is getting herself set up, the other thing that happens about this time of year is we also have to try and get people slotted to serve on committees in the coming year. We have a sign-up sheet that we will be passing around, and if you would indicate your interest in whatever committees you might be interested in serving on. If you already see names there, don't worry about it, just put your name down anyway, and somehow we will try and make this all work so that we have people who are interested serving on committees they are interested in serving on, and every committee has the people that they need.
And there's two sides.
To every story.
To every story.
It's all right. That's right. It's too true.
All right, so, the end of 2018, we sent out a survey to the board to ask about their feelings about the effectiveness of the meetings, and I'm hoping this would inform any changes that we might need to make. So I want to, first of all, thank, well, she got it to work.
What if you aim it at the processor? Yep.
You sure you don't want a button pusher?
Where is she?
Where is she? She usually does.
Eileen used up its limited supply.
Oh, here we go.
Whoops.
No? User error.
Fine, do you want to chair,
Is
Bonnie?
that right?
That one worked.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to thank you guys for those of you who participated. We had 14 participants, 11 commissioners, 3 alternates. And they ranged, you can see the tenure on the board, 3 years or less was over 50%, 4 to 8 years, almost 30, and about 12% were 9 years or greater. Part of what we asked was how often you report back to your town. And the highest percentage was 43% who indicated they responded occasionally to their towns. So we felt that was pretty good. That's good? Yeah. We asked how we could better assist you with the transition of new commissioners to the board. Highest ranked were Commissioner Handbook, Executive Director, Commissioner Meeting, advance information to commissioners prior to joining about the board and the committees, as well as a 30-minute introduction session for new commissioners. Other suggestions included providing a statement of the roles and organization chart showing the relationship of commissioners to the towns and the commission. I think that's come up as kind of questions as I've been listening to you all talk over the past several months, as well as commissioner mentoring. We asked how many of you participate in local government. 38% of our commissioners participate on local boards or committees and have other roles within their municipality. This gives a brief outline of the percentage on the different types of boards and committees. Okay. We were also well represented on the CVRPC committees. Thank you for taking that extra step to participate. The largest number of respondents participated on the executive committee, followed by participation on the TAC. We asked what we could do to increase your participation. Thank you, Don, for the picture.
Don, you got a nice picture there with Larry.
So many respondents indicated that, what you see there on the top, that they're just not available for additional participation. But other people did provide some suggestions, shorter meetings, more focused meetings, maybe earlier meetings. There was a suggestion of roundtable meetings with planners, development review boards, and zoning administrators. And there was also a couple that just said, ask us to participate. So, we inquired whether or not the information we provided you prior to the meetings is helpful and if it's provided in a timely manner. Good news was 100% of people said it was helpful. 69% advised it was provided timely. We do know this is something we're working on continually. And 86% indicated the agendas were well planned and clear. Some other helpful comments for us with the timeliness, that makes it easier to review. There could be, again, timeliness, consistency. There was a suggestion for some more detail in the agendas, and we particularly like this last one here, where presenters should try and make clear what the commissioner's takeaway from the presentation is. So I took that my first through as no pressure here. This one spoke the most to change. We asked the appropriate time and day for board meetings, and the highest ranked stayed as Tuesday, but at 6 o'clock. So that we come away from that saying this might need to be a discussion at a future board meeting as well, to whether or not we want to look at changing the time. Okay. Asking about the facility, 85% responded this is a good place to meet, but there were some interesting comments. The seating, which I think we're all starting to see, we're getting tighter and tighter here. Sometimes starting to come.
Yeah, good problem.
Sometimes issues with hearing. And there was one suggestion that a change of scene would be nice and give other organizations a chance to let us meet at their facilities. We heard Downstreet comment about theirs. One thing we talk about at the office a lot is that when you are going to other facilities, you have to be aware that you might get bumped if they're the type of facility, like say we went to the medical center and we thought we'd have it every Tuesday night. They might have a meeting that's going to bump us out of there. And so this facility here allows us to hold on to this time. So, okay, what could the board chair to do to increase effectiveness? The great news is that many responded that meetings are well run and organized and that she's doing an excellent job. Thank you, Julie. There were some good suggestions given. That maybe when new commissioners start, talking to them to encourage committee participation and ride sharing, limiting the back and forth discussion, indicating in agendas expected outcomes for topics, such as whether are we just looking to complete a discussion, are we going to have a vote, are we going to have, is it just for education, keeping meeting on time and track, and that some presentations could be more efficient. So, let's see, 100% responded that they felt free to contribute their voice and concerns. Staff participation, 86 responded they felt it was appropriate. Some of the comments related to that, and I lost track of my notes, please give me 1 second here. Okay, here we are, I'm sorry. There was a more information could be provided regarding staff specialty and if whether or not staff serve all towns. There was a suggestion, could we perhaps assign different staff members to different towns? I guess there's a little confusion in that regard. It was also mentioned that staff sometimes appears to be pushing for a specific answer regardless of feedback. So a couple good critical comments there. Okay, and move on. Meeting content and format. We wanted to inquire whether some of the things that we're putting in on our agendas are helpful. All of these rated in the good to excellent, high ratings in it. Legislative updates, it was indicated 100% felt that they were good to excellent. State plans and actions that we put on the agendas, 92% good to excellent. Topic speakers, such as we just saw, 79% good to excellent. Staff project presentations, 93% good to excellent. Training, 75% good to excellent. There was also some great comments related to this. Legislative updates and state plans should be provided with facts only, no opinions, so just give you guys the facts and let you create your own opinions. Information about upcoming and current planning issues and concerns were suggested. Discussions on Act 250 and zoning issues. We asked about updates and presentations from other organizations and their usefulness. 93% responded that they were somewhat to very useful. Again, there was a lot of great suggestions regarding who we might want to hear from in this regard. So some of these, it's kind of cool that as I was listing these out, noticing that we've already ticked them off the list this year.
Might be a reason for that.
Bear with me, I'm going to go through there's quite a good list. Energy planning, information for conservation commissions, Vermont Planning Information Center coming in to speak to us, how to get and use grants, review of process for amending bylaws and town plans, town forest management, stormwater erosion control, open space, long-range planning for transportation, public transit, on the economic development side, workforce training, TIF districts, housing, recreation. So, oh, there we are, I'm sorry, there was a slide. I missed my cue. So you can go on to the next one. You indicated some of the organizations you'd like to hear from in the coming year. We just heard from the Economic Development Corporation, the Chamber here, ACCD we already heard from this year, environmental groups, community-oriented groups, town planning groups, V-Trans, and affordable housing groups. So, want to know how you prefer information being conveyed to you for policy discussions. And the highest ranked was mix it up. Don't settle on just one way. So, rating pretty high was single speaker, panelists with varied viewpoints, staff presentations, briefing papers, and facilitated commissioner discussion. However, none of you preferred to have displays set up around them prior to meetings. Finally, we asked how meetings can better support your municipal liaison role. And we listed out here the suggestions, creating some time on agendas for you guys to share success stories, request help from each other, discussions on Robert's rules, opportunities to connect outside of meetings, something we'd love to hear more about, what you think those opportunities might be. Focus on what towns need to know this month, what's the hot topic. Okay. And we finally finished with the general comments that we received at the end of the survey where we just asked for what are your general comments. Staff and leadership performing better than it has in my years as a commissioner, keep up the good work, something we'd love to see. Policy presentations by staff should not be biased towards one perspective, present all information to develop policy. I think that was spoken to earlier in the presentation. Someone spoke of their gratefulness to be part of the board and finds the time spent informative and of benefit. Overall excellent meetings, staff doing an excellent job as well. Some feeling there can be a lack of communication between the staff, the commissioners in town, something that we're constantly working on. And thanking for another great year of support and soliciting this input. And I thank you for your support in completing the survey.
Great presentation.
Thank you, Nancy. We need to have a, I mean, that's something, that's up to us. We choose the time that's convenient for the most commissioners. And in some cases, meeting a little earlier might work better for some people. And in other cases, maybe it might not. But I would like to hear a little bit of discussion about preferences. Don?
I think historically, we've looked at this about every 5 years. And every 5 years, we come back to the same time.
I'll just offer the TAC moved our meeting time from 7 to 6:30, and Dan religiously brings pizza. Maybe that's not the right word to use, but it's all good. And so we've got a little something to snack on, because I think it's harder to get a dinner in for those of us who are not retired. You're still working, however you want to frame it. So to get dinner, in other words, before a meeting. But 6:30 seems to work well. 6 for those of us who work might be kind of tight. To get home, I've got to get home before I come here. But 6:30 I think is a great option. Get out at 8:30. That would be my vote, but I'm just one person.
So I heard a few mutterings about that suggestion. Again, I'm sort of looking for, is there enough groundswell to change?
I would prefer to see earlier as well, whether it's 6 or 6:30, but if we can compromise at the 6:30, I'd be very, very happy with that.
So I'm seeing some nods. I think the appropriate thing would be if somebody wants to make a motion to move our meetings from 6:30 to 8:30.
I'll make a motion that we have the meeting at 6:30 and adjourn at 8:30.
So,
and we make sure that we do the adjournment.
I'll second that.
So we have a motion by Lee, seconded by Alan. Do we have any discussion on this?
Could I ask if moving to 6:30 prohibits anyone from participating? Or makes it just so difficult that you'll... Okay.
I think Steve's points are good. You try to make it 6, and then people are wondering, about the eating part.
Yeah.
Although pizza wouldn't be bad.
I was about to ask you, I was going to let you do that vote and then ask you about food for 6:30 too, so.
So we're not voting on food yet. We're only voting on whether we're going to meet at 6:30. So any other discussion, comments? Hearing none, all of those in favor of moving our meeting time to 6:30, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Any abstentions? So the ayes have it, so we will be moving our meeting time to 6:30. Can we do this without food?
Food it is. Pizza, sandwiches?
I think the way Steve presented it, by doing it at 6:30, we can still get home and eat a reasonable hour and get here.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessary to provide food. I mean, it's a logistical thing for staff to have to cope with that. But the TAC, we have a social time at 6:15 for those of you who aren't familiar with our meetings, and it works well, but I don't think it has to be that way here.
It's also a smaller group.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Oh, the TAC is a smaller group.
Yes.
TAC
is a
than the
smaller
full
group.
commission.
It's, I will say that this is my first commission of 3 where food wasn't provided for the board at the meeting. It could be that in Franklin County, you had a lot of farmers who came straight from the barn. They had enough time for a shower, and that helped get them there. And in Lamoille County, people were commuting, so they didn't have time to go home for supper before they came. So it was important always to provide, and it was always pizza, but it could be something else. It's your pleasure.
We can try it. If you can't do it because your blood sugar is running too low and you need some sustenance, then you should make a point of speaking up, and we'll see if we can address that issue. Does that work?
I think it's a good plan.
Okay.
Was that a yes for food?
That was we'll try it and see if we need food.
Try it without.
We'll try it
Try it without,
without
yeah.
food, not, we'll try the food.
We'll,
Oh, I thought you was gonna try the food.
but, I have the impression though that if we had food, nobody would be complaining. Is that correct?
Yeah, I wouldn't.
Yeah, okay.
We'll just make it happen.
So, make it happen, yes. So we will move on. We have a legislative report this time. It came to you just yesterday by email, and I will let, there were copies, I think, up front, if you, hopefully you had a chance to pick it up on the way in. And I'll let Bonnie talk to this and drive the discussion that she's looking for.
All right. So the legislative report itself is 2 pages, which is pretty long, and then there's backup supplemental information. But there is a bill, it's S96, and it's related to clean water and clean water assessment funds for the state. This bill started as an Agency of Natural Resources discussion about how we achieve Vermont's clean water goals. In the past, the agency has said that through the regulation of stormwater, wetlands permits, other kinds of wastewater treatment plants, that those regulated activities would get us 90% to Vermont's clean water goals. And that extra 10%, they were fairly confident we could achieve on a volunteer basis. Now that we're further into the clean water discussion and what that really means, the agency is starting to say, well, the regulated part is only going to move us 80% towards clean water goals, and we're not so sure that last 20% we're actually going to achieve. That's quite a bit to look for from a voluntary perspective. So they asked for some conversations in the legislature about some concepts they had for how to address that 20%. The legislation started with a proposal that municipalities would form clean water utilities. So it's a utility is a form, well, you know what utilities are, but governmentally a utility is a type of municipality. It's municipalities working together on something. And that if municipalities formed these utilities, they would be eligible for funding. But you only got funding to help if you form the utility. And the reason you might want to form a utility is because utilities have taxing authority. So you had the ability to leverage monies, or a utility has the ability to leverage money to operate and maintain facilities, if you will, or whatever they choose to do. So that's how it started. And the agency had a conversation with a lot of different people. They had it with regional planning commissions, and we were not fully supportive of that concept. Our thought was that not all municipalities were going to choose to join stormwater utilities. And in some cases, based on watershed boundaries, they might have to join a couple in order to actually fully cover their territory. The agency's part of their thought was that you could have a utility made up of one municipality or several municipalities, and you could join several. So there were some challenges in the bill. We thought that at best urban communities would choose to join, but that especially smaller rural communities would be less likely to form a taxing utility. So they had a lot of conversations with folks. By the time the legislation got introduced, it still had the utility concept, it had evolved, and then it took, right before town meeting, it took a leap in a slightly different direction, a big different direction, leaving the utility concept behind and going into its current form that you have in front of you. And what that bill now does is creates, the agency has a list of impaired waters. These are waters that don't meet clean water standards. That in a impaired watershed, the RPC or other accountability entity, we'll say, would be eligible for block grant funding for the state. So think of this as a money administration program. The state saying, here entity, here's a money. We're giving you money and we're giving you a goal. You need to achieve so many pounds of phosphorus cleanup in 5 years with this money. Go forth, do good work. And by the way, if you don't, we're going to hold you accountable for it. And so it was a completely different move on the bill. There are some concepts in there, I think, that as an RPC, you might want to consider supporting, which was this concept of block grants is something we've been talking with the agency about for a while, regional planning commissions, watershed organizations, land trusts, because we're spending so much time writing grants for projects that you wonder if that energy would be better used doing projects rather than writing grants. So from administrative effectiveness, putting together a project proposal is different than writing a grant. It takes a lot less work. We recommended, and the bill did contain, that there be some sort of project prioritization entity. So if you think of our transportation projects, Dan takes the TAC through a process every year where they look at projects on the state transportation list, and these are on a statewide list, and then you say regionally, what's the most important projects in our region and why? And the TAC walks through that and gives priorities back to the state, and that becomes one level of scoring within the state scoring. So we suggested something like that for clean water might be appropriate, because right now, prioritization of projects happens when grants come in. So those who seek funding, you get priorities, but that's not necessarily the most effective thing you could do for the watershed. It happens to be who's ready to do work and where we're ready to do work. So we originally talked about the Clean Water Advisory Committees, our QUACs. The legislation proposes a council, kind of a watershed-based council that would work too, and suggest some specific membership. The accountability entity, moving back to that, which could be, again, the Regional Planning Commission or another service provider. The legislation says the Agency of Natural Resources needs to do rulemaking to essentially appoint an entity. So they could ask you if you want to be, and you could say no thank you, and they would look for another entity to play that. But they would prioritize and select projects for funding, be responsible for maintaining or ensuring maintenance of constructed projects. Right now, we're working with Northfield on a number of stormwater construction projects, have been for about 5 years. And at the end of we get the grants, we manage and administer it for them, and at the end of the project, Northfield takes on the responsibility for those projects and maintaining them for their useful life. So it could be something like that. You'd have to file a report that talked about the work you did and assuring the state that not only are you making progress, but that you're maintaining anything you build, and that you would help get the state data necessary for proving you achieved reduction. So that might be monitoring. Now, all of these block grants, I use Northfield as an example. This is aimed at that 20% of projects. That 20% of effort is about riparian buffers, rain gardens, the non-regulated things. So you're not talking about assistance to wastewater. You're not talking about assistance to 3-acre impervious surface that's required to be treated under a permit. It's a smaller, we call them the natural resource-based projects. So kind of moving along in here, I talked a little bit about if you didn't meet the goals or your targets, that the secretary of the agency can take appropriate steps to hold you accountable, which includes enforcement actions. They can truly hold you accountable for it. We talked to the Agency of Natural Resources attorney about that. He thought, as you might expect, enforcement is the last action, and they need to have some mechanism for accountability. They're likely to start with, you don't get as much money, or you get greater oversight. When you get to accountability enforcement, somebody's starting to be pretty blatant about, as they put it, not trying to try. You get the grant and you refuse to really try to achieve clean water benefits. And then they also in the bill still have money for things beyond the natural resources-based projects. So they would still have stormwater grants. If you have a stormwater permit, they'd have municipal stormwater assistance, think the roads grants. And the next version of the bill is expected to include competitive grants for things in non-impaired waters. So you're keeping waters that are currently healthy, instead of allowing them to degrade, voila, now you're eligible for grants. So let's try and keep some of those healthy waters healthy. So generally, when the Regional Planning Commission directors talked about this bill, our main concerns were two things. One was the enforcement piece. We're not regulatory entities, and if we're held accountable in that way, we don't have the deep pockets to take someone to court, nor do we really think that's our specialty. We work cooperatively, we facilitate actions, we help towns and nonprofits and other entities make things happen. We're not so much the enforcement mechanism. So what we're going to do looking into the future, if you guys agree, is we're going to try and work this bill towards A&R or somebody who's experienced in enforcement picking up that action if it's necessary. And then the other side is project maintenance, kind of worried us a little bit. Somebody builds puts in a buffer, because remember you're administering grants, or you're administering the funds, not grants. You're not necessarily going out and putting the tree in the ground yourself. What happens when the tree dies and you're accountable for replacing it? So do we have the pockets to pull maintenance out? And is that something we can actually do? Or to enforce against an owner, again, that enforcement issue if they don't. So in that case, we're going to work towards modifying it to make the accountability entity responsible for inspecting and monitoring. Do the trees still exist? Do they need replacement? And have the property owner or someone be responsible for the maintenance. So we're not, as RPCs, really built to be enforcers or maintainers. We're facilitators, we're conveners, we're helping other people get the job done. But we have tremendous skills in funding administration. That's working really well right now for the municipal roads program and the grants and aids that are going out to help towns with that. So this bill, right now, this is kind of an update. If you have any direction for me on where you'd like CVRPC to move it, or when we have those RPC conversations, the bill's moving. It's expecting to change a little more, but we do expect some version to pass this year. And then if that passes, the agency needs to do rulemaking and other things. It will likely be at least 4 years before, if we were the accountability entity, anything would show up on our plate. The rulemaking and other things they need to do, they need to assign values to say how much pollutant reduction does a buffer get you. So they've got a lot of work to do before anybody actually sees this. But I wanted to give you the heads up about this bill because it actually does look like something will pass this year.
When's the crossover date, though? Isn't that the end of this week?
Yes.
Friday.
Yeah, do you think the Senate will work on, pass it prior?
It's out of Senate Natural Resources, has had its first reading with the full Senate with no changes, and it's going to Senate Finance tomorrow. So I think they'll probably make it.
Okay.
That's why we think they're going to make it in moving the bill. It might come out looking much different than it does now. Think of the difference between the first draft and this draft that moved, but it is moving.
Plainfield takes water quality very seriously. We have participated in the WaterWise program. We're actually having a teach-in at Twinfield Union on March 30th with 2 other towns, Marshfield and Cabot, specifically regarding how landowners can help with water quality. We've actually worked with Central Vermont Regional Planning on a specific project which we've agreed to maintain to decrease distribution. I'd really like you to send a message to A&R that because Plainfield has one of the listed areas that is polluted on that list, that they're working at cross purposes. I can think of 2 examples of policies that they've implemented. For example, expanding Cabot Creamery's spraying of fields right next to the Winooski, and the hydro-seeding stuff along the ditches that increases the problem. And it's frustrating for me as a town official to hear them, all this stuff about, these specific areas and this and that, when their policies are actually contributing to the problem, which it sounds like we're going to have to clean up. And I think water quality is very important, and we've spent a lot of time on this. But if you could send the message to somebody there, that would be great.
So better align their own policies so they don't work at cross
Yeah,
purposes.
that in a specific area that you're complaining about, if you're issuing more permits to spray and you're having us doing this hydro-seeding, and then we were participating in other projects and we're trying to do the best we can to clean the water, but I find it just, ridiculous.
Can I ask, I'm not understanding the hydro seeding.
In other words, part
Why?
of this whole, Act 64 road maintenance is they're encouraging towns to line the ditches with seeding using a piece of equipment, which is then, when you seed, you sort of put all these nutrients so the thing can grow.
Right.
And there are people at A&R who are dead set against the seeding part of it. It's a controversial issue within A&R. But, they're having our road crew sit in on a seeding seminar and so forth. I just don't understand. There's no consistency in the policy.
Okay,
So,
we can do that.
I think it's too bad that we're just finding out about this, and that it involves RPCs, and we're just finding out about this. I think it's a horrible bill. I think it takes, A&R should be taking the responsibility, the accountability, and not pushing it off through RPCs. I used to work for A&R. They had a committee made up of the different programs where we looked at all the applications that come in. We prioritized the projects. And, and so why are they now wanting to push this off on someone else? I just think that they have the responsibility, the accountability, and screwing around with this for years in terms of numbers. I didn't hear you mention the percentage that ag is supposed to deal with. That wasn't in the equation. And then having this 20% that is kind of this magical piece out there that's not stormwater, that's not wastewater, that's not wetland impacts. So what is that 20%? Exactly what is it? Some of it could be riparian buffers, but how is it? It's just again, how much buffers can we buy? Can we buy everyone's easement along all these streams? We can't do it. So and the state doesn't want to pass any kind of regulation statewide. It would make sense for watersheds instead of having each town, trying to deal with these watershed issues, town by town. Doesn't make any sense. It makes sense by doing a complete watershed regulations for buffers. And then, the little homeowner who has a failed septic system, he's got to fix it today and do what you can. But the town, municipalities are dumping, gallons and gallons of sewage, untreated sewage into the river. And they're saying it's a small piece of the puzzle, but I can't agree with them.
Steve?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Alan. I just put stars by all of these streams and all in Waterbury, and there's a whole bunch of them, and it's a very amorphous goal, and I don't know how the state would measure, or the regional planning commissions would measure progress. One of these is 10 miles of Thatcher Brook, and it's stream bank erosion. So how, I think there has to be, and maybe the A&R in their rulemaking would set up some sort of water quality monitoring, but there's going to have to be a way to measure success. And I think that's one of the issues. These projects are all over the place. One of them is the Waterbury Reservoir winter drawdown. That's dependent on a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers project to repair the Tainer gates on the Waterbury Dam. The Regional Planning Commission and the municipality has no control over that project, and it's on the list. So I think there has to be a methodology that makes sense, and I would agree that the A&R is probably best equipped to deal with that. So that's my concern, is that in a rush to try to solve a problem, it's going to be very difficult to measure success. And then will there be enforcement based on a poor or a lack of really accurate way to assess success? So that's my 2 cents.
My 2 cents now. If you have stream erosion, that type of thing, and you just address it where there's an existing problem without having the regulatory process in place that would prevent that from happening in other areas, you're just going to be chasing that around. So if stream erosion is a problem, they should set up a statewide standards for staying away from the stream banks with your construction and everything else, and not just saying, well, you know, they disturbed the stream bank there. I was looking at the jail branch, which comes out of Orange, and downstream of that, they're talking about disturbances from construction and impacting it. Well, you know, if you say, well, we're going to address that disturbance there, but you still allow construction in other areas, you're not doing any good. So they really need to do a comprehensive statewide program on how you're going to address this, and not just do it by little pieces like they're doing here.
Can I ask a question? On this enforcement issue, I took it to mean when it said initiating an enforcement action that you would be asking A&R to initiate the action but not doing it yourself. Is that
That is
possible?
not what the bill currently says. That's at minimum what we'd want it to work towards. Is
Okay.
that you could refer it to A&R or something like that.
I find it hard to believe that they think you can initiate an enforcement action on your own. So that seems like the biggest problem to me.
Right.
The other
Yes.
question I had was, would writing local bylaws that required riparian buffers count towards a project?
At this point, I'd call the bill very general in nature. It is the equivalent, it's got some front-end things, but it says block grants to entities to do actions that will address this 20%. It doesn't specify what those actions are. When A&R does the rulemaking and the piece where they say a stream buffer of 5 feet has a pollution reduction value of a half a pound of phosphorus per 25 square feet or something like that, they have to put values to things, and you can either only use the things they put values to or recommend something that they agree has a value accounted for. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
You find an example from another state where they've valued something, you bring it back, A&R says, okay, that looks like it could apply to Vermont. So I don't know. Sorry, that should have been my first answer. I don't know if bylaws can do
That
it.
would seem like the easiest step to take because they're recommending that anyway, but I don't know if they're considering that
Okay.
as compliant.
I don't think they're that far down yet.
Okay.
They're looking for a global, how do we address the 20%?
Mhm.
And regulating the 20% through stormwater utilities, voluntary stormwater utilities, didn't get a lot of enthusiasm from most quarters.
So it looks like we could have spent more time on this topic, but we have already run out of the time that we have. So if you have additional comments, questions, talk to Bonnie.
Thank you.
And I'm hoping we can get through the rest of this rather quickly. We have meeting minutes from January 8th that are in your packet on page 15. Anybody interested in making a motion to
I
approve?
move to approve the minutes as written.
So we have a motion by Bob. Do we have a second? Seconded by Don. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you. I will remind you, our sign-up sheet for committees did not get very far around the table. We will put it up here on the corner. Can we try and take a look at it on
I
the
think we
way
have
out?
multiple sheets. Everybody has an individual sheet, so you don't have one sheet working.
So
Everybody's got a sheet.
look for sheets. There are these big pieces of paper. We're trying to get them.
Okay, there was only one here, so I thought there was only.
Oh, we're
We'll have them up here with the pen. We could do, or you could just email us.
Yeah, if you could put it
Yeah, we could
online,
put
that would
this
be
up.
good.
Yeah. Okay. We have a final item for the evening. Don?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion by Don. Do we have a second?
This happens to me all the time.
Seconded by Bob. No discussion on adjourning. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. See you in April.
See you next month.